Hey kiddos, welcome to Social Studies. Today we are going to be starting Lesson 1 in Chapter 2, and we're going to be talking about urban communities. I'm sure you've heard the word communities before. Remember, a community is just a place you live. So today we're adding the word urban. Urban means a really big city. I'm talking like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago. Those are really large cities. Now, Lima is big, but it's nothing like the urban communities we're going to be talking about. So urban means big city. Communities means where you live. So urban communities is a big city where you live. So some of the vocab words that we'll be talking about today are region, population, urban, harbor, and transportation. Let's say those together. Ready? Region, population, urban, harbor, transportation. All right, kiddos, follow along as I read to you the purple writing on page 42. All right, kiddos, here we go. Communities are different. They have different people, jobs, and histories. They also may be located in different regions. A region is an area with at least one feature that makes it different from others. The features of a community might include its landforms or climate. Another feature that makes a region different from others is its population. The population of a place is the number of people living there. All right, kiddos, let's break this down a little bit. So, region. What is a region? A region is an area with at least one thing that makes it the same as another region. Now, we live in the Midwest. The Midwest is known for farming, because there's lots and lots of farming that happens in the Midwest. There's also other regions, like the West. The West would include places like California and Oregon, places that are warmer, that also have a lot of mountains. So there's several different regions throughout the United States that we know of. Now, the next word we talked about was population. Population of a place is the number of people. So when you remember population, think number of people. A population is how many people live in a certain place. So how many people do you think live in Lima, Ohio? If you had to make a guess of the population of Lima, Ohio, what would you say? Well, let me show you. The population of Lima, Ohio is this many people. Can you read that number? It's 38,771 people. That is in the city of Lima, where we live. So there's 38,771 people in Lima. Now, of course, that number can go up and down daily. That can change because remember that people are born every day and people die every day. So that is an approximate number, meaning those things can change. So if 38,000 people live in Lima, how many people do you think live in Ohio? So Lima is the city you live in. Ohio is the state, meaning that Ohio is bigger than Lima. So that means the number of people that have to live in Ohio is more than Lima. So right now, I'd like you to shout out, how many people do you think live in Ohio? All right, well, let's see. How many people live in Ohio? All right, can you read that number? Well, this number is 11,542,645. Were you close? There's about 11.5 million people who live in Ohio. That's a lot of people. Now tonight, if you want to go home and find out how many people live in the whole world and tell your teacher, that would be awesome. So in Lima, our population is 38,771. In Ohio, our population is 11,542,645. tonight, go home and find about how many people live in the whole world. So remember, population is how many people live in a certain place. So today we're going to be talking about large cities that have over this amount of population. We're talking about cities that have millions of people who live there, specifically New York City. All right, kiddos, let's get back into our book. So now we're reading on page 43. All right, kiddos, communities large and small. How would you describe the population of your own community? It may be large, small, or in between. Your community may have a lot of people or just a few. Well, let's think about Lima. Is Lima large, small, or in between? I would say that Lima is in between. It's not a super small town like Bluffton or Cairo, but it's also not large like the cities we'll be reading about today. So Lima is in between. Find where we are, please. We are at urban regions. Now, what does urban mean? Urban means a big city. So we're going to be talking about a big city. Most people in the United States live in or near urban or city regions. A city is the largest kind of community. A city has busy streets, many people, and tall buildings. Cities need more schools and businesses than smaller communities do. In a city, crowded buses and trains carry people from place to place. All right, so let's see what these kind of places actually look like. So let me go ahead and pull up your PowerPoint. What we're talking about today is really large cities. So these cities are places that have tons and tons of people or a large population. The city we're going to focus on today is New York City. All right, so let's look. Urban communities, what do they have? Urban communities have busy streets, a lot of people, skyscrapers. Now, this is a picture of New York City. Notice how close the buildings are together. Also notice those tall skyscrapers. We have a few large buildings in Lima, but nothing like what you see here. So those are called skyscrapers, and the buildings are super close together. This is a picture of New York City from above, or an aerial view from a plane. Notice that there's absolutely no space between those buildings. Kids that live in big cities like this, most of them are going to live in apartments or a place called a row house, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Notice you don't really see any green space. Kids that live here are not going to have any backyards. And most people don't have their own cars, which we'll also talk about later. So this environment is completely different than what we're used to here in Lima. It has a lot of people. Most people in big cities walk. Notice that they're almost shoulder to shoulder. So you will have lots and lots of people walking around during the day and even at night. This is another picture of New York City during the day. Notice all the traffic, all the lines of traffic that you can go on, and all the people walking around. Also notice how close those buildings are together. So New York City is different than what we're used to. It's a really big city with a really large population. All right, kiddos, let's go ahead and go back to our books, and then we'll come back to our PowerPoint here in a few minutes. All right, go ahead and turn your page, and we are on page 44. All right, kiddos, find where we are. We are now going to be reading about another city. This city is called Baltimore. Say, Baltimore. Baltimore, an urban community. Let's go ahead and read this. Here we go, guys. Kelsey lives in a row house building in Baltimore, Maryland. On her way to school, Kelsey sees people opening businesses for the day. Other people are catching buses to their jobs. A picture of Kelsey City. The city of Baltimore is located on the Patapsco River. More than 500,000 people live in the city. Long ago, Baltimore began as a place where goods were loaded and unloaded onto ships. Over time, it grew into the city it is today. Kelsey's area of Baltimore has people of many cultures. Living in Baltimore allows Kelsey to learn about these cultures. Remember, we learned that culture is a way of life. So if you live in a big city, a culture, you're going to have so many different cultures. You're going to have so many people from different backgrounds in different countries. Now, let's talk about Baltimore. We said that Lima has 38,771 people. If we would visit the city of Baltimore, it said it had 500,000 people. Well, 500,000 people is this many people. Do you see how much bigger that is than Lima? It is way bigger. So if we visited Baltimore, Maryland, it would have 500,000 people or 500,000 people. These kind of communities are much, much bigger than we're used to here in Lima. So let's talk about where kids would live if they were in an urban area or a big city. These kids are going to live in row houses or skyscrapers. These are houses that are very close together, and they also have no yards. You'll also notice that these houses do not have garages. That's because most people in the big city don't have cars, and also because there's not room to put garages. So let's see what these row houses look like. These are row houses. Each house would be of a different color. So notice you have a black, a red, a blue, and then it kind of repeats the coloring. Each of these houses is your own house. So notice that they're sharing walls. You're going to be able to hear pretty much what your neighbor next door is doing, especially if they're playing really loud music. So they're going to share walls. They're also going to share the street or the sidewalk. Notice that you don't see any green space, and that's because there's no front yards or backyards. If kids your age want to go play in urban areas, they're going to have to go to a park or another place around their neighborhood. But again, notice no garages and no backyards. This is another picture of another set of row houses. Again, notice that they separated the houses out by different colors. Notice that the houses are not super big, and they do share walls. Also, people are parking outside of their homes, so they're parking along the street. If you own a car in a big city, that's where you would park most of the time. But again, most people do not own their own cars in big cities. This is a skyscraper. Notice that each of these have their own balconies. So each of these is a different family that's living in the skyscraper. There's a family here and a family here and a family here and so on. So if you live in a big city, your options are pretty much live in an apartment or to live in a row house. Because all the buildings are super close together, they don't have traditional homes like we have here in Lima. All right, kiddos, let's keep on going. Let's go back to our book. We are going to be on page 45. 45. All right, kiddos. This picture here is a picture of Baltimore up at the top. So you can kind of see it looks very similar to New York City. It has those skyscrapers that we talked about earlier. And this is what is called a harbor. A lot of our big cities, New York City, Chicago, Baltimore, Los Angeles, they all have huge harbors, and they got so big at the beginning because lots of boats could come there. Harbors are places where boats can come and they can drop off people or they could drop off goods, meaning clothes or food or things like that. So a harbor is just a place where boats can come closer to shore. So let's go ahead and read about this harbor in Baltimore. Everyone find where we are. We are at Living in Baltimore. Kelsey's parents moved to Baltimore to work there. Her mother rides the subway or underground train to her job at a local hospital. Baltimore also has a light rail system. A light rail is like a train. It rides on a rail and carries people. Kelsey's father works in a skyscraper, a very tall building. The building is in downtown Baltimore, the city's main business district. A business district is where many businesses are located. On the weekends, Kelsey and her family visit many places in Baltimore. At the Inner Harbor, they go to museums and watch boats on the river. A harbor is a protected place with deep water that allows ships to come close to shore. So the word harbor, say harbor. A harbor is a place where boats can come closer to shore. So let's see what that looks like. So a harbor allows ships to come close to land. Remember, it's where the water is much deeper, so a boat can come closer. This is a picture of the inner harbor in Baltimore. Notice that there's 2-3 boats already parked at the harbor. So you could ride on a ferry, which is a boat that carries people, into the harbor. Also, ships can bring things like bicycles or cars to the harbor as well. This is a picture of that same harbor that you saw, but during the day. This is a close-up part of the harbor, so you can see just how close that ship can get to land. So again, a harbor is a place where boats can come close to land. All right, kiddos, let's go ahead and talk about transportation. Turn your page, please, to page 46. All right, kiddos, now let's first talk about this card. This is called the Metro card, and it says, New Yorkers use Metro cards to ride the subway. When I visited New York when I was in college, all of us had a Metro card. It's kind of like a credit card, and you put money onto the card, and it allows you to ride different modes of transportation. Transportation is just the movement of people and goods. So if I use this card, I could ride the subway, or I could ride the bus, or I could ride the elevated train. So we're going to talk about the different types of transportation in big cities because they are way different than what we're used to here. All right, kiddos, let's find where we are. We are at other urban communities. Here we go, friends. Baltimore is at the center of one of many urban regions in the United States. Some other cities are even larger than Baltimore. New York City, New York, is the nation's largest city. It is located near a harbor on the Atlantic Ocean. Cities are often located near harbors and rivers because this location makes transportation easier. Transportation is the movement of people and goods. People in New York City have many ways to get around. They ride the bus or the subway to get from place to place. Many people choose to walk or ride bikes. Chicago, Illinois, the nation's third largest city, sits in the middle of the country near Lake Michigan. Like Baltimore and New York City, Chicago has many businesses and people. People in Chicago ride elevated trains that circle the city. All right, so let's see what the transportation is like in a big city. So, what is transportation? Transportation is the movement of people and goods. So what that means is transportation moves you and me, but it also moves goods. Now, what are goods? Let's think about this. If I go to Walmart and I buy a bunch of groceries and I put them into my car, those groceries become goods. And then my car takes my goods or my groceries back to my home. So it's the movement of goods. So transportation isn't just the movement of people, it also moves things. All right. People do not have their own cars in big cities, especially when we're talking about New York City. Really, the only people in New York City who would have cars are people who have a lot of money. There is nowhere to put those cars, and so that's why most people choose not to have a car, because you don't have a garage or a place to park it like we have here in Lima. So remember that in a big city, a big urban area, most people do not have their own cars. When you're in the big city, you would take what's called a taxi. Raise your hand if you've ever ridden in a taxi before. Well, taxis aren't free. You have to pay for your ride. And so you wave with your hand and you ask the taxi to stop. You get inside the taxi and then they start a little meter. And the meter then determines how much you would pay them for your ride. So the longer the ride, the more you pay. So one mode of transportation in an urban area is a taxi. Another mode of transportation is the bus. Now in Lima, we do have what's called a city bus. These aren't the same as a school bus. We know it's a school bus if it's painted yellow. But in a big city, there's different kinds of buses. Notice that up at the top, it'll tell you where it's going. It's the same thing in Lima. The city bus in Lima will tell you where you're going. Now that Metro card that I showed you earlier, you can scan your Metro card on the city bus, or you can just give them the money to get you to where you need to go. So notice, I didn't say people have their own cars. In big cities right now, you could take a taxi or you could take the city bus. This next one is called a ferry. You can notice here it says the Staten Island Ferry. This ferry is spelled F-E-R-R-Y. It's not a ferry like Tinkerbell. This ferry is a boat. And what people do is they get on the boat and then the boat takes them to where they need to go. This is New York City in the background. So a lot of people don't live in New York City. They live outside of it, like in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And then they will take the ferry into the city. That way, they don't have to worry about all the busyness and all the traffic. So another mode of transportation is a ferry. This is called a subway, and I'll show you in a little bit how you get down to the subway. The subway is underground or underneath your feet. So if you're walking in New York City, you wouldn't even know that there's a bunch of subway systems right underneath you. They're underground tunnels, and they're trains that take you from different places. Now, these are electric, and so it's important that the people stay behind this yellow line until the subway comes, because if you had fallen here, you could get really hurt. Notice that the subway has these numbers on top. In New York City, the subway system is based on numbers and colors. So if you're riding a subway to get to school, you would have to know the number you ride on and also the color, because if you get on the wrong subway train, it's not going to take you where you want to go. So notice this is red line 5, and that's how all of those things are determined in New York City when riding the subway. Now, when you're in New York City, there's different places that look like this. This is how you get onto the subway system. This is going to be at the ground level or at street level. Notice that the stairs go down. That's because the subway is underneath your feet. Now notice all of these different colors and numbers. S blue, N yellow, Q yellow, and so forth. Those are the different train numbers. So if you're riding a subway system, you have to know what train to go on. All of these trains are going to come to this station, and you have to pay attention and make sure that you get on the right train. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get there. It was very interesting when I was in New York City because I got to take a group of second graders on a field trip. And instead of riding a bus, we had to ride the subway system. We had to make sure that the kids got on the right train, and we also had to get on quickly. The subway goes super fast, and if you're not on the train, the doors will close. So this is what that looks like. This is the inside of a subway system. Notice that it's super crowded. Now, a subway has doors that open and close, just like a school bus, but they don't wait on you to get on like a school bus does. You need to get on quickly because the doors will shut quickly as well. Notice that people are holding on. This man in the back is holding on to the rails at the top. There's rails here. That's because the train goes super fast. It goes from 0 to 60 in a matter of a couple seconds. So it's important that you are holding on or you will fall over. Another main mode of transportation is your bicycle. Bicycles can be brought into houses. Remember the skyscrapers and the row houses I showed you earlier? Well, those areas are not super big. And so people will have their own bikes and they will be able to take them into their row houses or their skyscraper apartments. So a lot of people in an urban area, a really big city, have their own bicycles. Now, we can't forget about walking. This is Times Square, one of the most popular places in New York City. If you've ever watched the ball drop on New Year's Eve, that's called Times Square. Now, most people in a big city are going to walk. They're going to get a home that is close to their work, so they're able to walk there. So remember that walking is also a main mode of transportation because walking is a movement of people. Every time that you walk, you're moving yourself. All right, kiddos, that's the end for social studies today. I hope you learned a lot of different things. So remember a couple of things. The first one, population. What is population? Population is the number of people that live in a place. Remember, Lima's population is about 38,000. But if you go to a big city like New York City, it's in the millions. So population is the number of people who live in a place. Also remember the word urban. Urban means that you live in a big city. That means New York or Chicago or Baltimore. Urban areas have skyscrapers. They also have row houses. Remember, those kids are not going to have backyards, and there would not be garages. Now let's talk about transportation. Transportation is the movement of people of goods. Remember, most people in urban areas do not have their own cars. They use subways, buses, bikes, ferries, walking. So remember that most people in a big city do not own their own cars. All right, kiddos, we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.